I put this together this morning because there's a lot to importing a rent roll in the MFA. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of steps required to make sure the rent roll is in the right format. And then it gets accurately mapped into the MFA. So I wanted to show the steps here. So you have a rent roll, and a lot of times the formatting is difficult. So you got to run it through the rent roll formatter that cleans up the formatting, makes sure numbers are stored as numbers, dates are stored as dates, removes all the extra spacing. And then you dump it into the MFA rent roll mapping tab in the MFA, and you map it. And once you map it, you refresh the dashboard. You can see everything for the rent roll. We'll walk through that. And then you can ultimately import it into the underwriting model into the unit mix section. Now, I wanted to make it clear that this entire process is optional. Like you could jump right into the unit mix in the underwriting model and just put in manually what the unit mix is, the bedroom, bathroom square footage, and skip all these steps. But the reason for doing this process here primarily is that it gives you the rent roll dashboard, and you can analyze the rent roll and you can see what lease trade outs have been over certain periods of time. And we'll look at that. I find this incredibly helpful for understanding the business. How is the property performing? Are rents trending up or down? As well as setting my rent strategy in the underwriting model. But again, entirely optional. I wanted to provide a visual for the steps involved. I'd say if you have a good rent roll that's fairly clean, this process may take 10 minutes or less. If you have a rent roll that's particularly difficult, has a lot of different unit types in it, that kind of thing, it could take 20 minutes or more. So, okay. So the entire training today is focused on this section of the underwriting model. It's the unit mix rent interior renovation strategy, right? So the way we fill this out, as I mentioned, is you can actually just fill this out directly from the offering memorandum. That's probably the quickest way. But if you want the insights that you gain from analyzing the rent roll, we're going to walk through that step, that process for importing that. And then there is the part of the renovation plan. So what are you going to do? What's your business strategy? How many units are you going to renovate at what cost? And what is the premium that you're going to receive? And this ultimately drives your gross potential rent in the underwriting down in the income section below. This is by far the largest number in your pro forma by magnitude of 10x or more. So this is where I spend a lot of time in my underwriting because it's a huge impact on the output of the model. So with that, we're going to go ahead and...
Hey, Craig, what do you mean by 10x? What do you mean by 10x?
I mean that the GPR in your pro forma is 10x the next largest number in your pro forma.
Which is what?
It depends on the property, but it could be your other income. It could be your property tax in some models. Depends on the property. But point is, this is a large order of magnitude larger than any other number in the pro forma. And so it has a much heavier weight. It has the ability to swing the returns, right? If you use your GPR, you're going to have better returns. Or if you don't do the analysis and it's too low, it's going to impact the returns on the model. So it's really important to dial in your rents and your renovation plan. Does that answer your question, Kim?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so with that, we are just going to jump right into the first step of the process, which is evaluating the rent roll. So here's the rent roll I have. This is pretty common. This is a real page rent roll. I very much dislike this format because what it does is it puts a unit in one row and then has additional fields for that unit in additional rows, right? This is very difficult to analyze because Excel really likes to have one row per unit. Much easier to analyze if you have one row that has all your data for each unit. And so what I did is I built the rent roll formatter to do this for us. What it does is it collapses this into a nice table that we can then import into the rent roll or into the rent roll mapping tabs of the MFA model. And so what we do is I'm just going to copy this rent roll data, all the way down, very bottom. It's very important when you copy the rent roll data that you don't copy all the summary data below. We don't care about that. We just want the actual rent roll data. So that ends right here. And I'm going to hold the shift key before I click, and that will highlight the entire section. So I clicked on the first cell in column A that had the column header. And then I hold the shift key and I click on the last cell in this last column to capture all the data. I'm going to copy that. And then we'll go into the rent roll formatter. This is the tool that's available when you subscribe to the MFA-ADVANCED tool. And you see it just says paste your rent roll right into that cell, and that's what I'll do. So I paste that rent roll. It's pretty straightforward. So there's two different types of rent roll. There's a single row per unit. Sometimes you'll get these. And then there are multiple rows per unit. So this means that there's a unit number, and then there are multiple rows that kind of support that unit number or have data relative to that unit number. So this is a multiple row. If by chance the wrong radio button is selected, it will turn it red in most cases. Sometimes there's like a lot of merged cells and it doesn't capture that. So you got to make sure to toggle it correctly. So this is a multiple row per unit. And then there are 4 fields that I have to input. It's the header row. Where does that happen? It's on row 1. The first unit. So this is the unit that is in, sorry, I should blow this up for you. That's in unit cell, or sorry, the first unit is in cell E2. Okay. The charge code column. So this is where all the charge codes are broken out. So this is what identifies what these charges are. So this is the charge code column. You call them O. So I just put O in the charge code column. And then the charge amount. So these are the charge codes, and then these are the corresponding amounts. And that's what we need to identify. So once you have all that filled out, it takes very little time. You just click the modify rent roll, and it collapses the rent roll so that it's in a nice table that we can import. So there we go. Now, this is a format that Excel likes. 1 row per unit. I can copy this information and paste it into the MFA. So in the MFA, we have the rent roll input tab. This is where I'm going to go and clear this out. This is where we paste in the rent roll, and then we're going to map the columns. And then we are going to map the bedroom and bathroom, and we give it a unique unit name. And we'll walk through that real quick. So again, I'm just going to highlight everything here. All the way down. Copy the entire rent roll. And it's very important that you're capturing the headers as well as the data below. So all of these headers up here I want to capture. And you can see in this, here we go. In the mapping table, we have a header row. So you want the header row to land on that row. And the first row data comes right after that. You don't want any spaces. So I just pasted that in there. And then we go through the process of mapping it. So it's very simple. There's a mapping table right here. It tells you what to map. And you kind of want to map it in this order, with the unit number being very last. That's the absolute last thing that you map after you've done all the steps. And there's instructions down below and a video that walks through this process up here. But we're just going to go through and we're going to map all these. So I'm going to go through in the floor plan. This is the unit type. So I'll map that. And as soon as you map a field in here, you'll notice it's no longer available in the pick list. So you can't accidentally map something twice. So we'll map square footage. There's a really important thing to understand about vacancy. So there are 2 fields that identify vacant units. There is, sorry, let me get my trackpad. There's the tenant name. So oftentimes you can see right here, tenant name is, man, this trackpad. I'm terrible with a trackpad. Okay. I don't know what's going on. All right. So the vacant unit is right here. You can see in the occupancy field, or it says lease status. This is an occupancy field. You can see it says vacant, and then it has another word. It says lease, or it could be vacant, unleased, or whatever. It has a lot of different options. I typically gravitate towards mapping the tenant name because I find that field is cleaner. I just want to know vacant. I don't want to know all this other information. And that is just easier for the model to pick up. If you do map both, if you map tenant name and you map occupancy, the occupancy is primary. So if you map both of those, the model is going to look at occupancy first and only. So if you don't want to use occupancy, it's an optional field. Don't use it. I typically, again, I map tenant name. One important thing about dates, dates are optional in terms of populating our underwriting model with the rent roll information. However, dates are very helpful for the dashboard because I could use the dates and I could trend out when leases are signed, when people are leases are expiring, things like that. I can see how long they've stayed in the apartment. And so dates are very nice. There are 3 dates that I care about. There's the lease start, the move-in date, and then the lease end date. If your rent roll has all 3 of these, you're good to go. Lease start is when the current lease that they have signed has started. Move in is when they actually physically moved into the property. So in this case, you can see they moved in September of 2020, but their lease start is September of 2022. So they've renewed on September of 2022 in this case, but they actually moved in 2 years prior. That's helpful. Some rent rolls will not have a lease start date, right? Will not have a lease start date. In those situations, I just for the dashboard so I could see the trend, I will copy the move-in date. I will paste it at the end of the rent roll over here, and I'll map it to lease start date, just so I have a move-in date, a lease start, and a lease end, and that makes sure my dashboard is complete. Now, the move-in date is not as good as the lease start because it'll show leases way out in time in the graph, and we'll look at that in just a second. So lease end, and then I'm going to check. So this is the market rent. And then we've got our rent column over here. I want to map my rent. And then month to month is an optional field. I use this sometimes, right? So sometimes month to month is called out in the rent roll. Like if there's a month to month premium called out, not often, I'm fine with it. But if there is a month to month, you can map it. It's optional. It doesn't affect anything. We'll look at the output in a second for that. But that's it. So everything's mapped except for unit number. I could come over here. I could see everything's green. And now I got to do the bedroom, bathroom, unit name. That is performed here in this unit type mapping table. So once I've mapped everything, it displays my unit types. And I can just go through and I could put in the bedroom, bathroom information. Okay. And then I'm going to mark by putting in the bedroom, bathroom. Oftentimes this will correspond exactly with the offering memorandum. You'll see this in the offering memorandum under the unit mix. You just look at that. You could pretty easily identify based on units, or maybe the offering memorandum might actually have the unit type. So you could figure out what the bedroom and bathroom is most often from that, as well as the renovated units. So these are fully renovated. These 6 units, the A2 and the B2 is also a full renovation. So now I have my mapping done. The very last step is to map the unit number. However, I want to make a point here. This unit name in the table here, this is the name that's going to carry forward into your dashboard, and it's also going to be the name that populates in your underwriting model. So if you have some additional information that you want to capture about a unit name, maybe some of these are townhome units, you can overwrite this to be whatever unit name you desire, right? You could say 1-1 townhome, you could type whatever information you want, and the model will aggregate based on this information here, and then that will populate your underwriting model. So, very last step, we're going to go ahead and
on that. Do you just can type there directly now? Because I thought previously I would have to go up to the formula and put like the quotation, the capital and or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, very good question. That's how I typically do it. I will go ahead and I'll modify the formula. I just put an ampersand at the end of this formula and then quotes with whatever I want it to say. You don't have to. Sorry to mislead you there, Victoria. I find it's easier to do the ampersand, then I don't lose my formula, but I could just do ABC, right? I just type right over it.
Oh, okay.
So the only issue when I type right over it, I lose the formula, right? So if you want to go back and put in a formula, you could copy it from below and you could paste in the formula, right? And then it'll put back the formula. But that's the only risk with manually overwriting any of the values in orange, right? Like these, is there formulas that you can overwrite, but when you do, you lose that formula.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, and Victoria, to your point, so what I'll do, the reason I do that is, let's say you have a unit, a rent roll with lots of unit types. Maybe there's like 20. I don't want to go manually handwrite all those. So I'll just modify one formula with, like I said, I'll just do ampersand and I'll do the quotes and then put in whatever I want. And then I'll just take that formula and I'll paste it down to all the unit types below that I want it to have that information in. It's just a little quicker to modify the formula instead of manually typing.
Makes sense.
Okay, so we're just going to map the unit number. Once you map the unit number, it pulls the data into the rent roll summary. So this is our rent roll dashboard right here. So I mapped the unit number and now all this data is populated. The one step that you have to do before you start analyzing the rent roll is that you have to refresh data. There's a lot of pivot tables that feed the graphs below. And unless you refresh the data, it's not going to show you the current information. They have to do that. I have this last refresh so you can see when it was last done. And it's taking a long time because I'm on Zoom. We'll let it run. But while it's running, I can tell you, so everything on the left here, the unit type, the bedroom, bathroom, square footage, this is all pulling from the rent roll now. The unit type is based on our mapping, and then everything else is the rent roll. So the in-place rent and the market rent are directly from the rent roll. This is the information. If I choose to populate it into my unit mix, into my underwriting model tab, this is the information that gets populated. Everything else on this dashboard is optional. So that's why when you look at the mapping table, these are the required fields. And these are all the nice to have fields. Like the dates are used to break these out, these leasing windows. The graphs below use the dates quite a lot. We'll take a quick look at this. So there are 30, 60, and 60 to 90 day leasing trends. So it's looking at the leases signed and it's using the lease start date for this in those timeframes, right? Based on the most recent lease in the rent roll. In this case, it's 2022. It's a very old rent roll. So it's using the 30, 60, 90 day windows based on this date, which is the most recent lease. And then I turn it red anytime there's a decrease in rent from the prior period. So you can see it went from 1036, there are an average of 9 leases here. And then it went to 1017. So it went down a little bit. There's 16 leases, and then it went back up to 1026, and there were 5 leases in the 30-day window. There's a min max. Here's the month to month. This is the only place month to month gets used in the model. So if you map it, if you don't map it, this would just show 0. In this case, we had month to month information, and it showed me there are 2 leases that have a month to month fee of $200 on average. We have vacancy by unit type, and then we have 1 year turnover. 1 year turnover is important because we know on average, roughly, depending on a lot of factors, but people will move about every 2 years, right? So if you see a 1 year turnover that's maybe in the 20% range, then that could be a sign that the rents are too low at that property, right? That's a really low turnover. There may be headroom in the rents, right? If you see a 1 year turnover of 60%, that could be a sign that people are not happy. Maybe it's a rent issue. It could also be maintenance or some operational issues. But we just like to look at 1 year turnover. It's one indicator for the performance of the property. And then I won't go through all these graphs in great detail. It's pretty self-explanatory. get the rents by unit type, turnover by unit type. I do want to mention this rent trend by lease start. I use this all the time. So if you have a lease start date, an actual lease start date, that's what produces this graph. And what you could do is you could say, based on the lease start dates, how is the rent trending at the property as a whole? Is it going up or down? And I could filter it over here on the left using the unit type filter. It lets me. And I can say, okay, on the 1 bedroom, not sure what happened here. We had a dip, but overall in the last like 6-8 months, looks like the rent's going up a little bit slightly, but that's a good sign, right? A lot of properties I look at now, it's going the other direction. And it's very telling because a lot of times the property or the broker will tell you, oh, rents are doing great. They're signing, they're seeing $200 premiums or whatever. You can look at the trend yourself based on the rent roll. So
Hey, Craig,
we have a lot of good conversation. Yep.
what does the dotted line represent here?
That's a trend line. So what it's doing is taking this dark green line and it's drawing a trend line based on all the values in that dark green line.
Gotcha.
So if I go to the 2-1, yeah, I don't know why there's a dip there. There might be a data issue in the rent roll, but overall the trend line is up. So, and then you have your lease expirations. This is pretty interesting. Usually you see it higher during the summer months, right? More people move in the summer months. Just something to kind of pay attention to.
Hey, one thing that you mentioned in the past on other videos, I don't know if you want to mention it again, was putting the slicer in. Putting the slicer in for that lease rent trend, lease start date. That was pretty helpful.
Excuse me. Yeah, I won't cover that here. It's a little bit more advanced. Sorry. And that is, I think, more useful if you don't actually have a lease start date. So if we were to map move-in date in the rent roll as lease start, this trend would go way back, like years and years into the past, all the way back to whoever's been at the property the longest, right? So if you have somebody that's been at the property for 5 years, this timeline will blow out 5 years. And so adding a slicer on this specific graph is helpful in those situations. So you can actually just look at the last 12 months of this graph because those will be the newest tenants that have signed or have moved in. But yeah, I won't cover that. There is a video on that, but it would take me too much time, at least right now. We're trying to get to a good point. Thank you. Okay, if you're happy with this unit mix, with the way this looks, this is how you want to do your analysis. You want to do your renovation strategy. What you do is you click Populate Unit Mix. This takes this data and it puts it into your underwriting model. You can see it's going to give you a warning. If you have done any work in the unit mix, it's going to overwrite it. So just be aware. I click yes. And there we go. So the data from our rent roll is now contained in this unit mix. So the values that you see for in-place rents, the values you see for current market rent are directly from the rent roll. I'm not saying those are correct market rents. That's the analysis you have to do to determine if they're correct. But these are what is in the rent roll. Sorry. And then the next steps are to, 1, determine your rent, like to verify if these are accurate. And then 2, determine your renovation plan. So I will touch on that. So what I will do typically as a first pass, let's say we're going to renovate all these units that are classic. We're just going to put that in. So right here, I've just renovated the ones that are not renovated. And we have 66 units here. So I'm going to renovate all of those. Now the renovation costs, I'm not going to go into too much philosophy on how to determine renovation costs, but here you just put in whatever you want for your renovation costs, depending on like the level of fit finish, the asset type, things like that. So we'll just go, I don't know, 7,500, and I'm going to go 9,500 on the bigger units. And then what is the premium that you're going to get? So let's say right off the bat, I'm just going to say 150 and 225. And so what we can do is we can do a rent comp analysis against our underwriting here to see if we need to adjust these rents up or down based on the competitive set. And the way we do that is we have a rent comp tool in the model we click on. And so what we do is we fill out, let me blow this up. We fill out this information, right? This is all fictitious, by the way, but we fill out what we want to do is we want to find assets that are similar in age, similar in size, the number of units, and that are in close proximity to our subject. So typically first pass, I will use apartments.com for this information. It's the easiest. It's all consolidated there. And I will manually fill this information out. And then once I get enough of a sample, I will start to look at my apartment versus the sample. So if I go to the 1 bedroom, I click on this link, what we can see right here is the brown is our classic rent. The light green is our in-place renovation. Those are the renovations that have already been done on the property. And the dark green, those are the renovations that we will be performing and the rents that we expect to receive as a result. You can see we're very much middle of the pack. I really like the scatter plot. The scatter plot's nice because you can see it draws an average line of the properties, and then you can see where we stack up against that average line. Typically, I would probably recommend that your classic units are below this line. If your competitive set contains both renovated and classic units, right, then I would say your classic unit should be below the line, your renovated probably above the line. So we might have some room in our 1 bedroom to move the rent. So what we could do, to go back to the underwriting tab, we'll say, hey, you know what? I do think our post renovation, maybe it's going to be more like 195. And then you can go back to the rent comp. And it puts it right about the average. So I'm going to leave it there, right? Again, do your research and figure out where you want to be on this relative to your comp. But I'm going to leave it at that. Take a look at the 2 bedroom. 2 bedroom looks very low to me. Even our classic, right? Look at the scatter plot. See if it tells the same story. We're very low. So I think we can kind of go up on our 2 bedrooms. I'm going to say, hey, even for the classic unit, maybe we're probably like $1,250. And then the renovation premium we get, maybe it's closer to $250. We make those changes, go back to the rent comp. Maybe a little bit better. Maybe even our in-place renovation, we can move it up a little bit, right? So you could just keep going back and forth. And with the in-place renovation, maybe this needs to be 13.25. So this is kind of the process. Once you have the rent comps filled out, find a place you're comfortable and say, okay, that's where we're going to be for this property. Any questions on that? I know I went really fast, but
yeah, Craig, how many properties do you typically want to have in your comp set? 5, maybe 5. I mean, the more the better, I think, but
absolutely. Yep. It really depends on the market you're in. I say this all the time. I know it depends on the asset, the market, all these, but as many as you can, I would say minimum 3, right? Minimum 3, if you could get 3. And I mean, personally, I would like to see like 7 or 8, because that gives me a bigger distribution. And if they're all similar age and size and location, that's great, right? Then I get a really good, I'm more comfortable with the rent they pick. That's not always the case. Sometimes we look at properties that have very few rent comp. So that is more challenging, and you got to just kind of put your line in the sand where you think the rent's going to be. And then again, you don't have to do this in a silo, right? So if you're really serious about an asset and you have a good relationship with property manager, you can always ask them. We do that quite a bit. We do all our own homework and say, this is where I think it should be. Can you give us feedback, right? So you're not putting a huge burden on them. They can just give quick feedback. Yeah. So I'd say minimum 3, Caleb. 5 or more would be ideal. Okay. Final stretch. We'll just cover this real quick. So costs. Like I said, I put in an arbitrary cost here, just kind of guessing. you can get more detailed with your your repair detail. That's this worksheet here. And you can really dial in by unit type, right? So if these pick lists, so the way this works is like I pick the unit type from this pick list. You see the 11650. I want to make it clear that this pick list will only populate with those unit types that you're renovating. So it looks at this. I'm renovating 666 of this 1-1. If I don't have track time, if I don't have any units I'm renovating, it's not going to appear in the pick list. So I just want to make that clear. But here's where you can really get detailed with it. Right? You can kind of come in here and you say, well, I know appliances cost $1,800. You could go through line item by line item, what you want to do to each unit. It'll come up with a per cost unit and a total cost based on the number that you said you're going to renovate. And then on the right, it's showing you that, hey, in the underwriting right now, you have 7,500 a unit. Based on this analysis, I came up with 8,500. The difference is about $65,000 in my renovation costs. So my more detailed repair detail was higher than my initial estimate. Once I go through this process, I can determine whether or not I want to actually use these values. And if I do, I click this button, transfer repair values to underwriting. Once I do that, what it does is it takes these per unit costs and puts it in my model format. So now you can see 8475, and I think this one's probably too low, but 9175. So it overwrote my initial estimate with what was in the repair detail. And then you set your rent premium. So we kind of went through that process. We looked at our rent comps. We determined where our renovated units should be. And that is determined by our rent premium to get to our renovated rent and the ROI. So we covered a lot of information here. Grateful we got through it. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I got a question. We've talked about renovated rent, return on investment. I've asked you about this before, and you're like, yeah, I mean, it's a good calculation, but it's not, it's not exact. And so you see something that's like, say it's 15-20% rate of return on your money, a return on investment. But I guess it's nice to see that initially, but why don't you like to see that calculation as much? Or what are your hesitations with that calculation?
So the ROI when it comes to the per unit type renovation is just to measure like the cost that we're putting into the units to renovate and the rent premium that we're going to receive. Is there enough ROI there to make it worthwhile? And again, it ultimately, when we evaluate a deal, it's based on these metrics at the top, right? IRR, cash on cash, AAR. But we do want to keep track of a per unit type. And I can tell you that this is important, actually, Gabe, because if that ROI drops below your IRR,
every dollar invested takes it down. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, exactly. So so if your ROI drops below your IRR, it's costing you money to actually do these renovations.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we do pay attention to that very closely. We just underwrote a deal this week, and it was I think it had like a 13% ROI. And I'm like, no, take it out. It doesn't make sense to renovate if it's 13%. And we took it out, and then it actually boosted our IRR by doing that, by not performing renovations and just assuming our business plan will be to operate and stabilize.
Yeah.
So it's a metric. It's just like all these things are just kind of like just help you dial in these little bits and pieces of the underwriting. I do think this one's pretty important to pay attention to. Make sure that the dollars we're putting into these units are generating the revenue that we want.
So here's another question. Say that you've got, in this scenario, you got 66. Say we're in a scenario like you just said, where it doesn't really necessarily make sense to renovate all these units, or Yeah, let's go with
Yeah.
that. Doesn't make sense, but we know we're going to have to put some money into them. Typically, I mean, this is where, say you want to put, and nothing's perfect whenever you take over an asset, right? Someone moves out, you'll probably have to put $3,000 into it. Does that sound fair? About $3,000. So how do you account for that? So say you have these 66 units that you're not going to necessarily go in and renovate, but you know you're going to have to put some money into them eventually. How do you account for that in the capital raise or whenever you're initially are raising the money for the deal?
I guess it depends on the timing.
Is that just
of
is,
that?
is that covered? Is that covered in your repairs and maintenance and turn, or is it covered in that typically?
Yeah, exactly. So we're doing that right now on one of our assets. Is that we had quite a few vacancies when we took over, so we decided strategically that we're going to roll about half of those vacant units into make ready. Right. So that's where that make ready budget comes in. So if you know you're going to be turning a lot of units just for make ready, you're going to have that cost. You could roll that into your pro forma, and then it's kind of above the line at NOI. Or if you're going to do the renovation, that's kind of falls into our Capex budget, and that's where we'll allocate the dollars. Now, it's kind of up to you on how you want to play that, right? You can actually in the model.
Because I think it's smart. I think it's smart to initially, whenever you take over an asset, like I said, it's never the way you want it, right? You're gonna have to put the $3,000 into it. And I felt like typically we have like $250 per unit for unit turns, budgeted out. But is that only once the asset is stabilized, or does that cover our initial whenever we go in?
Good question. Yeah. So a couple ways to approach it, right? You can have a higher year one make ready cost in your pro forma and then bleed that out. It doesn't mean you're going to have the dollars to actually do it though. So, I think in that situation, if we knew that we were going to have some like stabilization costs, let's call it, right? We're going to need to raise money for, I would probably just put that in here. If we need the money, if we know we needed this extra sum of money on close because we're going to have to stabilize the asset or kind of do some repairs, but they're not full on renovations where quick you get premiums for, then I would capture that Capex cost. Or somewhere
Exterior Capex probably.
Yeah, you could throw it in exterior Capex just to account for those dollars, right? Or you can, like I have it here, right? You can see I have Capex. So this Capex is going to be captured in my model, right? So you can see that Capex right here, the interior cap. So let's say you're just going to do $2,000 a unit.
I guess my issue with that would be, and I think you've addressed this a little bit, is you don't want it sitting for 2 months. If you're just putting 3,000, that should be a pretty quick. Yeah, that should be a pretty quick turn. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it really depends on the current performance of the asset, right? So, I mean, if you have like a really high vacancy on takeover and you're going to put a few dollars into it up front, or if you're just expecting to do this through turns over time, over the first, like as people move, it might change how you want to capture those dollars. But yeah, I mean, part of that is, you could capture some of the Capex. Part of it, you could say, well, that's going to be part of my operating reserve, right? These additional dollars come out of that. Couple of ways to approach it. Do you have any other questions?
Victoria, you got any questions? I could go for days, but I'm not going to.
No, I like your questions, Caleb. The only question I had, wasn't related to the rent roll. So if you've got more about rent
No. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was hoping you could run through on the debt structures, like the refi scenarios again. Because, I think there's a lot of confusion when I talk to people about this between the supplemental and the second. And I guess
yeah.
in the industry, a lot of lenders, it seems like they're referring to a second loan as a supplemental loan, and it's causing some confusion.
Yes, they do. Yeah, it is confusing because they're both technically supplemental loans. So anytime you take on a second loan on acquisition, right, that a lot of people call that a supplemental loan. If you go onto Freddie or Fannie's website and you look at their supplemental loan program that comes on later in the project, they also call that a supplemental loan. So I try to differentiate in the model between second or supplemental in that way. And I do in this comment right here, I do define it, the second or supplemental, but I definitely understand the confusion because technically they're called the same thing.
So a second comes at the beginning, right? Of the underwriting. Yeah. Okay.
Yep,
As opposed to supplementals.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
A second starts and ends in line with your acquisition loan or your primary loan, right? So it comes on at the beginning, and if you end up doing a refinance, it's going to terminate with the acquisition loan. But a supplemental is a loan that is offered just, as far as I know, it's just Freddie and Fannie that offer the supplemental that can come on at a later year. So let's say you're doing a heavy value add and you get the property stabilized and you have a Freddie loan. You could go back to Freddie and say, hey, we're stabilized. We want some additional capital. And they'll put on a supplemental on top of your primary loan. Mm-hmm. So it functions very similar to a refinance in the model, with the fees being significantly less because you're only being charged a fee on the additional amount that you're taking out instead of a refinance, which is a fee based on the entire loan value for the property. So it's more cost effective to do supplemental. It's a little bit easier because they already provided the initial loan, so they have all the information.
Are those rates like in line with what your original loan is, or the current market rates, or how is that on a supplemental?
It'll be market rate at that time.
Okay.
And typically higher than a primary loan.
Typically higher. Okay.
Yeah. Higher interest rate. Does that help, Victoria?
Yeah, that helps for sure. I had a lot of people ask me about that, and that is what I was telling them. But when you keep telling other people that, you start doubting. You're like, I hope I'm giving them the right information. I better ask Craig about that on the next call.
Yeah. Craig, and I only modeled that agency supplemental loan because that's a favorite of Rod and Scott. They've done that a couple of times, so they really wanted that in the model, that ability to see it.
Okay.
Craig, so that the interest rate on the supplemental will typically be higher than the primary? Not always. Will it?
Yeah. You could go onto Freddie's site to see what they're charging for the supplemental. But yeah, when I looked at it, it's been a while I've looked at it, but
yeah, I guess my point would be in 3 years from now, rates could potentially be less, and so you have the ability for it to be less. Correct? The supplemental could be less than the primary. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the underwriting magic, right? It's trying to predict the future.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, if you feel rates are going to go down over time, then you may model a lower rate. You may want to. But in today's dollars, right? If you look at a new acquisition loan with Freddie and then their supplemental rate, the supplemental rate's higher.
I think that's it. It's pretty straightforward thing today. I liked how you showed, the ROI and whether it's worth it or not to do those. Would you say like 20% is probably what you'd want to see at a minimum to make it worthwhile?
20% implies a 4-year payback, and that's kind of the minimum that you want to see. You start really splitting hairs below that, right? So if you get an 18% ROI and your IRR is like 17, right? You're getting a little benefit from those renovation, but it's a whole lot of work for just a very moving the needle very little, right? There's not a lot of margin for error in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Rod always talk about 3-year payback is more ideal, but it's really hard.
30%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Craig, I got a question. This was
Mhm.
mentioned. This was mentioned by another warrior, just through conversation. We talked about GPR growth from, I guess, in the first year. So from takeover to first year.
Mhm.
And we've talked about it before. It's like, you'll see some of these numbers and you're just like, wow, this is crazy. The GPR number that they have here.
Yeah.
Is there a certain percentage that you don't want to see the, I guess, I don't know if maybe it's net revenue, maybe, or effective revenue. Is
Mhm.
there a certain percentage you don't want to see effective revenue
Yeah.
go above, like a 10? What he mentioned was 10%. You don't want to see greater than a
Yeah.
10% increase in effective revenue. And I didn't know if that was a good rule
Yeah.
of thumb or a bad rule of thumb, or should it be 20%, or it depends on how big the value add is. But I guess just kind of rule of thumb, wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I have also heard the 10% metric used. I don't know how effective that is. I mean, it really depends on so many factors. I will say that your year one GPR, right, that's just a function of your market rent. It's like, where do you
Right.
think your market rents should be today? That's all
Sure.
that is. And
Sure.
then how many renovations are you planning to do through the year? And that'll be your renovation addition to it. But if you have a large loss to lease at the property, you're going to back that off quite a bit. If you have a large vacancy, you'll back it off, right? Typically, I will see a lot of the income, like in the deals that we underwrite, sometimes if it's a heavy value add, sometimes our EGI will be 0 or actually negative in year one. So, but I would say, yeah, if you're looking at a deal and it's like 20% in year one, that's probably a red flag. Like, well, how are you going to drive that kind of revenue, especially if they're planning to pull units offline to renovate them? Because that is very costly in the model, right? That vacancy is expensive. You're turning a lot of units. Now, so just side note for you guys, I just saw a webinar from somebody and they hired a contractor company and they will do the renovations, the interior renovations with the tenant living in the unit. And it takes them 1 to 2 days to turn these units. And they have these crews come in, they take all the tenant stuff, move it to the middle of the room. They rip out cabinets, they do everything, and then move all the stuff and do the flooring, and then they put all the tenant stuff back by the end of the day. And I'm like, I've never seen anything like that. It was crazy. I think I have the company's website bookmark. That was really interesting. So a lot less downtime. And
can you share that
okay.
company's? Can you share that company's website?
Yeah, I will try to find it. I'm certain I bookmarked it. It's just my bookmarks get messy sometimes. I'll find it. I'll send it over to you guys. It blew my mind. So that's a huge cost in year 1 and 2, right? If you're pulling units offline, but if you can minimize that cost with some strategy like that, maybe you can achieve more than 10% revenue growth in year 1.
So 10% is kind of year 1, maybe, that no more than 10%. What about year 2?
Oh, year 2 is going to start taking off because if you get units turned in year 1, that additional revenue that those units are generating are helping to offset the classic vacancy. So I typically see that year 2 starts. I mean, it really depends on how long the renovation timeline is, but I do see year 2 and then definitely year 3 pop. And then it goes back to kind of like stabilized growth for most like 2-year renovation plans.
Yeah. And you said typically
again,
about 4 units per month. Is that what you guys are seeing right now?
It really depends on the contractor. So what we got going on right now with the San Antonio asset, that they're cranking. They're probably doing 6 to 8 units right now a month, but they're not. Some of the units are lighter turns, right? Some of the units already have LVP, but they're not having to do the flooring in those units. We're not replacing the cabinet boxes, so that helps. But they're actually moving faster than we had initially budgeted.
Fantastic.
So, I mean, yeah. It's
I have a
helpful.
question on that. Like, could you use your on those data tables that we're looking at with the lease expirations? Is that kind of, because obviously you don't want to renovate the units unless they're vacant, unless you're doing like you were just talking about with that company, right?
Mhm.
So is that kind of how you would know how many you could do a month?
Yep.
Because that's something a lot of people have brought up as a concern is, oh, you're, saying that we could do 6 a month. Well, what if there's not 6 units vacant,
Yep.
And they hear, like on this one here, there's a bunch of months where it looks like it's 0, like,
Yeah.
May, June. Yeah. Oh, well,
Yeah,
sorry,
exactly.
May, June,
So, I mean, I think for the most part, if you're doing a heavy value add, you typically budget 2 years in the underwriting model, right? There's going to be some seasonality with the lease expirations, but just talking big numbers, round numbers, right? 2 years, because at that point, all the leases will have reached their term, and you have the opportunity to renovate during that time frame. So, but yeah, when you get right actually into the deal, that's when you really pull the rent roll, and then you sort it by lease expiration, and you look at the months and figure out, okay, what is it actually going to be? Right? We got a whole bunch coming online this summer. Do we have the capacity to actually renovate them, or are we going to just try and do a smaller portion of them? That's the conversation we're going through right now, trying to figure out how fast can we go. But yeah, so I actually went through the process, and maybe I deleted it by now, but there was a hidden tab in the model where it did this. It compared your lease expirations versus your renovation plan, and it highlighted where you got negative. But what I found is it's not useful at this stage in the deal, because oftentimes the rent roll is a month or 2 old. And then by the time you close the property, like 4 to 6 months will have gone by from your initial analysis to when you actually close. And everything's different by then, right? You're going to have to redo that whole analysis. It just was not useful to try and go to that level of detail for the underwriting. So that's why big numbers plan usually on heavy value add about 2 years if you're doing a lot of units, because you're certain to capture those lease expirations over that time.
Got it. Okay. I've got a jet,
Anything
guys,
else?
so
All
I
right. Thanks,
really
Victoria.
appreciate it. Have a good day.
Yeah.
See you guys.
you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you,
All
Victoria.
right.
We'll
Thanks,
see you later.
guys.
Have fun.
Take care.